Hello, thanks for being in a brand new video. This time I have a full review of the GoPro Hero 13 Black. Let's get started. GoPro has possibly the most popular action camera on the market, especially for a more professional use, and it is in this aspect where they have focused the improvements of this camera. We will not find drastic changes at the level of a standard user with respect to the last version, but there are new features for professional use. But before we go on, let me tell you about its price. In Mexico, it has been launched at 8,999 pesos. On screen is the reference price in dollars, but remember that the prices here are not the same as over there. Just take it as a reference and consider that this price is without accessories. Evidently, it has a very good range of accessories, which could also be an attractive and strong point of this device, but you have to buy them separately. So let's start by taking a look at its design. Just as I anticipated you, in this case the body is practically the same as the last generation. There are no drastic changes in this regard. We are going to find a weight of 158 grams considering the battery and 121 grams without considering the battery. On the right side is the mode and power button, and on the top we are going to find, in addition to a microphone, the button to start recording or capturing photos. On the left side, we are going to find this same cover that we have seen in past generations, although in this specific case, we could remove this cover and place a more advanced cover to have a new magnetic connector for the battery, which would allow us to give continuous power to this camera so that it doesn't shut down at any time. As you realize, this is one of the first changes and it is very focused on professional use. If, for example, you want to keep it recording constantly or keep it transmitting through an HDMI adapter, you can perfectly achieve it. Here we will find access to the battery, which we will talk about a little bit later. And of course, we can also place the micro SD card here on the bottom. We still find this same folding mount that can be quite useful for not having to place an additional accessory, although we already saw this from past generations. But here the novelty is that it also comes with magnetic absorption, so you can buy separately another magnetic mount very similar to the one used by DJI. And this way you can assemble and disassemble with much more speed. That is one of the main changes that could be useful for a more everyday user, not so professional. But as I say, it must be purchased separately. But one of the important new features is that you can now add a mount that will click and have magnetic absorption. So it's going to be much easier to put on and take off this mount. And I think this is one of the changes that could be considered more attractive for a daily user, which professional users are also going to appreciate a lot because it's much easier to put it on and take it off as opposed to using it without this accessory. But remember that this is sold separately. Just like last generation, you can in this case rotate the lens to remove it and attach another lens. Only last generation you could only attach the max accessory, which gave you a much wider perspective. In this case you keep this possibility. In a moment I will show you the results of how the image looks with and without this module. But it is definitely very attractive for those who want an even wider scene. But as I say, we already saw this last generation. The novelty will be the new modules and also that the camera is able to detect them. For example, in this case, I also have this module that will add macro capabilities, which definitely looks much more attractive also for more professional content creation. But it will be manual focus, so you have to turn this ring to be able to adjust the focus, so you don't have as much dynamism as you would have on other cameras with autofocus. But at least you can already have a much more accurate focus on closer objects or people. I insist, in a moment I'll show you the result. For now, let's remove it. Finally, we also find the ND4, ND8, ND6, and ND32 filters. With these filters, you can greatly reduce the amount of light that enters the lens. Notice that in this case, it practically looks like a mirror. But this is for much more professional use. If you are a more casual user, these lenses will be unnecessary. But that's why I'm telling you that this camera has decided to upgrade to offer much more professional capabilities. In fact, they are also developing another lens that will give you a much more cinematic look. So I think it's interesting what we're going to have available on this camera soon. But this kind of lens swapping, I think you can take advantage of it more on a professional level than on a casual level. The screen that we will find here will be quite simple, which is 2.27 inches in size. It really is a simple screen. The technology is LCD, so it's not going to offer us such faithful color. In fact, it usually looks a little bit of a paler shade, although it does give us a good level of brightness. And in fact, generally, LCD screens are usually built into cameras because the indicators that are constantly fixed could actually burn out the OLED screen. So it has pros and cons. Because the image quality really isn't that attractive, but obviously it's not going to burn in or deteriorate that much. As you notice, it has another screen in front of it, which in this case is 1.4 inches in its diagonal, with exactly the same technology. But in this case, we're not talking about a touch screen. And in the settings, you can choose how you want the display to be. If you want it to be completely off, if you want it to just show you the count of shots that you're taking. Also, if you want it to show the whole scene with the original ratio of your recording, or do you want it to fill the screen completely, depending entirely on your taste. But it would definitely be much more interesting to see touch controls directly on this screen. In that sense, it still feels like a simple experience. And well, this camera can be submerged up to 10 meters deep without any special accessories. But if you buy a special case, you could go even deeper. Inside it has the GP2 processor, and new for this generation is the return of GPS. So when editing your videos through the Quick app, you can add the metadata information that is recorded in the files, both photos and videos. Although obviously activating GPS is going to consume more battery. If you want to have a better battery life, it is recommended to disable GPS. As for the microphones, we will find 3 placed around the camera. In this case, I insist that it is a camera very focused on the creation of professional content. So generally in the professional field, the audio is going to be completely separate from the video. And I think that's why GoPro has not put so much emphasis on improving audio capture at a more basic level. I say that because it doesn't have a wireless microphone like we see on, for example, its main competitor. That is the Osmo Action 5 Pro. Still, obviously, it's going to pick up good audio, but if you want to connect an external microphone, it will have to be through an adapter and it will have to be wired, or else it also has an accessory to have a directional microphone. And that can record you with better quality audio when you are talking in front of the camera. But I think that in this aspect, if it is perceived a little weak if we compare it with its competitor recently mentioned.
Esta es una prueba de audio grabada con los micrófonos integrados de esta GoPro Hero 13 Black.
Interestingly, in this case, the manufacturer adds the ability to connect wireless headphones to use these headphones as microphones. Mainly, they point out that it is compatible with AirPods, but in general, it can be with other headphones. However, the microphone quality of the wireless headphones is pretty straightforward. They go much more focused on calls, so I don't really see that as an improvement or a major draw. What would be interesting would be for GoPro to release their own wireless microphone so you can quickly plug it in. Before we go to the photo and video examples, let me share with you a bit of technical specs. Since in this case, the sensor it incorporates is still the same size as the last generation, so we will not really see an evolution in image quality, especially in low light conditions. We are talking about a CMOS sensor of 1/1.9 inches and a lens with a focal length equivalent to 12 millimeters. It's ultra wide, and if you add the other accessory, you have even more wide. Only its aperture is f2.5, and if you combine the f2.5 aperture with a relatively small sensor size, we can anticipate that it won't perform as spectacularly in medium light or low light conditions. In this case, it lets you take 27 megapixel pictures, and you can take them in both JPG and RAW. But let's take a look at some of its results, even though it's not a still camera. While this camera is not for taking pictures, if it is capable of making this kind of captures with a resolution of 27.13 megapixels, taking advantage of all the information of the sensor, as you realize it is a sensor with a more or less square proportion. So photographs that take advantage of all the information on the sensor will appear with this resolution. It's definitely a good level of detail. You can crop some things out and use them with good resolution. But I insist it's not a camera that's 100% focused on photography. Although you could actually take pictures in RAW if you want something much more advanced, with a GoPro's own format. But as I say, in general, I think the pictures come out with a good enough quality, without it being the highlight of this camera. Something curious is that it allows us to zoom, so you can take advantage of the entire 12mm focal length, or you can have a perspective of 39mm applying digital zoom. Although in this case, it is noticeable that it is digital zoom. It doesn't maintain 100% of the quality, but I think it can help in some moments in certain frames. Remember that this camera has fixed focus, so it's definitely not going to work for macro photography. Although in a moment I'll show you what the result looks like with the macro lens you have available, for video recording and also for photography. But with the factory supplied lens, you can't have macro capabilities. However, I think it's a very action focused camera. So generally, you're going to use it in outdoor environments with very good lighting. And in those environments, the image quality is really good. Especially talking about color and texture. Definitely its primary use will be for video recording, and in that regard it uses the H.265 codec as the only codec available, so if you need recent devices to be able to play this content. Since this level of compression is going to allow you to record for a longer time, it has the ability to record in 8 or 10 bits. In fact, if you record in 4K resolution or higher, it's bound to be 10 bits, so it has very good color depth as well. 5.3K in an 8:7 ratio, which is the whole sensor, a more or less square ratio, which is going to allow you to have various framing, although obviously you could also shoot in other formats and resolutions. For example, note that in this case, the configuration will be quite simple when checking what video quality you will be recording in. It has the HLG profile if you want to record HDR video, or the log profile if you want to colorize your video afterwards. Both of these are much more professional options. For a more basic user, there is the standard profile, where you can select different types of framing, different resolution adaptations, and in this case, the different frame rates per second. As you can see, in Full HD, it's capable of up to 240. In 4K, it's capable of up to 120. And in 5.3K, it's capable of going up to 60 in this mode. However, there is also the slow motion mode, where you can have a little bit more adjustment. You can also adjust the digital lens to have a much wider perspective, simpler or with horizon lock, which would be the recommended setting for scenes with a lot of action. In fact, with regard to stabilization, it only has a setting off, on or auto boost, that will be improving and adapting the stabilization to have a kind of balance between good power consumption and good stabilization. And then it allows you to configure more things about the capture. If you need to schedule this capture, if you want it to have some specific duration, there's also hindsight, which will let you somehow record 15 seconds before or 30 seconds before you press the button. Then it's going to be recording a buffer, so that you have the ability to record very specific moments ahead of time. And then there's also the timer. And finally, the zoom, which is completely digital, up to 1.4x. I'll show you the results in a moment. And in the ProTune settings, we're going to be able to change the color depth, the bit rate, which is standard, although it's varying automatically as well. But we can raise it up to a high rate if you want the highest quality video recording, where you would go up to 120 megabits per second. This is recommended if you are going to record scenes with a lot of action. In my case, I'm going to use the standard rate. It also allows you to adjust the exposure compensation. You can also set the white balance manually, also minimum ISO and maximum ISO. And there's also the sharpness adjustment, noise removal, and finally the color, if you want a little more simple tonality or more saturated colors. Finally, as for the audio, it also allows us to record in different ways. For example, you can record a raw audio track, completely separate from the video. And you can choose what processing you are going to have. So it can help as well. It allows you to have an adjustment of the audio if you want to have an emphasis on the voice or you want a standard setting. It also has wind reduction. And then finally, there's the option here to connect other microphones to it. With accessories that are sold separately, the maximum recording resolution is 5.3K at 60 frames per second. You're looking at one of the examples, albeit rescaled to 4K, but it really shows a very good level of detail and obviously good fluidity overall. It's also going to give us good colors. It has a very similar color perspective to what we see on the iPhone. If you want to take it as a reference, that is a little bit warmer colors, a little bit darker colors, pretty sharp contrast, and obviously you have several settings to set the gamut if you'd rather not have as much distortion around the edges. We are just looking at the first of the examples, but in general, as I say, it will allow us a good quality recording with good lighting and good color. Now you're looking at the second clip I recorded as a selfie. We are also going to see a lot of amplitude in this lens, although in the maximum amplitude setting, the movement is perceived a little weird, especially when turning, but it is something that you can modify later in the settings. The image quality is again very good, confirming that the color is very similar, as I said, to the color rendition of Leaf. It reminds me a lot of the setting you see on that device. Overall, it is a very good image quality. Even from now on, you start to perceive that it has a good dynamic range, as it does not completely darken the face or overexpose the sky or clouds in this environment. Regarding the stabilization, I think that freehand is not as good as it is when it is on a fixed surface. Note that in this case, I'm running with the camera in my hand, and if I were to notice a little of these movements of rotation, especially in this wide angle, I insist that if you use a tighter setting, possibly the stabilization will be of much better quality. This version has a bus mode for stabilization in order to save the battery. So in scenarios where you don't need so much stabilization, it is going to be more reduced. And in scenarios where you need more stabilization, it is going to consume more power. However, for these types of scenarios where you're running freehand, I think it's better to use horizon lock so it's clearer how horizon lock works. Look at this example where I'm running and I'm going to intentionally turn the camera left and right. Sorry if you're getting dizzy, but watch now what exactly the same movement looks like but applying horizon lock. Notice that the movement is much more controlled. You don't even notice that I turn the camera left and right constantly. That's why I tell you that in freehand scenarios, it is much more advisable to use the horizon lock, which gives spectacular results. But now watch how he is stabilizing some scenarios of much more action on a motorcycle. Notice that the movement is much more controlled. You don't even notice that I'm constantly turning the camera left and right. That's why I tell you that in freehand scenarios, it is much more advisable to use the horizon lock, which gives spectacular results. But now watch how it stabilizes some scenarios of much more action on a motorcycle. The truth is that it does an extraordinary and very good job, although in this type of scenes with much more action. I would recommend activating the high bitrate mode, because in normal mode, if you get to perceive a little bit of pixel is losing a little bit of definition, but the stabilization is just perfect. Remember that it will use different sensors, gyroscope and more to help with everything that has to do with stabilization, and definitely that it is totally good in this regard. No complaints at all for these kinds of action-packed scenes, and note that in this case the lens is better adjusted to avoid more distortion on the edges, so you can set everything to your liking. But what I really liked about the camera is that even when recording in 4K at 60 frames per second, it is able to maintain this level of stability, which, as I say, is really very good. In this case, the camera is mounted on the helmet, and it definitely looks spectacular in terms of stabilization. Remember, it's a camera that's very much focused on professional use because of the new options that they've enabled. So for recreational use, it has quality to spare, plus obviously these scenarios with a lot of dust or even being in the water won't affect it at all. In fact, in scenes where you are not moving forward, for example, but slightly more static, the image quality looks even better and the bit rate seems to be adapting. In these scenarios, there is either not so much movement. Either way, if it's over 50 megabits per second, so you have a lot of quality, then it will be pretty good quality, both in scenarios with a lot of action and in scenarios that are a little more static. But to give you a better idea, see how it looks with the stabilization off so you can see how difficult it is to stabilize the whole scene. Definitely without stabilization, it is not recommended to use it, although if you are going to have the camera in a completely fixed place and want a better battery life, it is advisable to disable the stabilization. So that's why it's appreciated that you have the option to turn it on or off, but obviously for action scenes it won't be advisable to turn it off. This is exactly the same route, but now with stabilization turned on, and definitely, as I say, it's highly recommended for these kinds of action scenes. But besides stabilization, let's evaluate other things like dynamic range and see how even with a very bright sky, it keeps good colors and everything in general looks good. Applying a test that we are more used to, I realized that it does have a very good dynamic range. Notice that it shows perfectly well-balanced highlights and well-balanced shadows. In this type of scenarios, recording selfie type, it also has a special HDR recording mode that you can view with specific monitors. The result looks spectacular on compatible monitors. If not, you must apply some different color profile to be able to see it on traditional monitors, otherwise it will look a little burned, but these are more professional tools that anyway give very good results. And in the recording mode, we will also find very professional capabilities. Obviously, the result looks pale and you don't apply a post-production, but it has a lot of information, so if you have enough knowledge, you could color the video in a better way. In our case, we don't have such good skills, and anyway, we achieve positive results. So if you are a professional, you will know much better what to do with this. But definitely, the dynamic range of this camera is very good. Just as another fact, in these kind of much more static conditions, the bit rate is below 50 megabits per second, so it seems to be adapting it to not consume so much battery. But the weakest point of this camera will undoubtedly be the night recording. Notice that there is a fair amount of noise that it tries to blur, but with this it loses quite a bit of detail. There is very little light input with this camera. In this case, I'm applying the widest lens setting, but it doesn't really influence the amount of light that I could get, so it can suffer quite a bit from light trespass, but as a benefit, it maintains a very good level of stabilization, so you don't really see this kind of significant shake that you might notice on other devices at night, so it maintains good stabilization by sacrificing light input. The scene does look quite dark, so you'll need to be in well-lit environments. If you want to have good image quality, otherwise it can come out very dark. So night scenes are still a weak point of this camera. Now let me tell you more or less about the range that we can achieve with this camera. This is the widest setting without stabilization, so we get a huge perspective, although it has quite a bit of distortion on the edges, as you notice, but in return it gives you a lot of width, and so it would look more or less like in selfie mode, a lot of amplitude. Even part of your hand comes out in the camera. The width is a very nice benefit that this camera gives you. Now, activating the stabilization will obviously apply a bit of cropping to the image, but you still have a very wide perspective. In this case, still with quite a bit of distortion on the edges, both in the back and in selfie format, but it's still a pretty good image. Now, with the super view setting, we are going to have a more cropped perspective with virtually no distortion. As you notice, the hand no longer looks stretched out as it did before, and with the wide angle setting, I think the distortion is completely eliminated, although it is a much less wide perspective. However, for selfie mode, it still has plenty of width, it's just less wide compared to all the width it can achieve. However, if you want to avoid distortions altogether, you can enable this setting, and it also has a setting called linear, which is more cropped to have a more traditional camera perspective, in case you want to record with this perspective. And something curious about this camera is that it allows you to record in a more or less square ratio with a very high resolution. What could this be useful for? Well, for cropping both vertically and horizontally. So look at how I can record perfectly with this format and then crop vertically to make it look like the video was originally recorded that way. Or we could also crop horizontally, and it really is a video that for content creators can be useful because it gives you good breadth for both perspectives. And in fact, a funny thing is that it also allows us to record vertically by having the camera held in landscape format. So if you want, you can have this thanks to the ratio that the camera sensor has. Obviously, the camera also has different capabilities to make time-lapse. In this case, I recorded a simple time-lapse with slightly accelerated movements, which could be useful for recording movements of people, but you can record much faster with respect to its slow motion capabilities. There's good news because you could record in 5.3K at 120 frames per second, giving you lots and lots of resolution and good slow motion. Although you could also go up to 360 frames per second. However, at a slightly higher resolution than HD, but it's really a low resolution, but you could still get very, very slow scenes. In fact, in HD, you could get up to 400 frames per second, but again, it's not that attractive anymore because it's not that high a resolution. Now, with respect to the extra accessories, I want you to look at this reference video, which is the maximum range that the camera can give us without the special ultra-wide lens that you can buy separately. Now look at the perspective that you can get with this lens. Do you really have a range that is multiplied even more, achieving something completely spectacular? Obviously, you will have some distortion at the edges, but the result is simply spectacular in terms of width. Completely recommended, although it must be purchased separately. Now regarding the filters, if you're in an overly lit environment and not shooting in log, you may not notice the difference. Are you watching the reference clip now? You're watching the video with the ND4 filter, which for all practical purposes looks very similar. Now you're watching with ND8, which I insist looks very similar. It's mainly going to help you in scenarios that are heavily lit or for recording, simulating that there's less light than there is in reality. But I insist it's a much more professional use. Now you're looking with ND16 and it looks pretty much the same in this scenario. That's why I insist that I think this is much more for professionals who know specific use cases. Because personally, I don't find it so much. You're finally seeing with the ND32 filter, so for me it was practically the same. But I insist, professionals in recording this type of video will know how to take advantage of the fact that you can put this type of filters that is not available in other action cameras. Now, with respect to the lens that adds macro focusing capabilities, it will also be important. Notice that in this case, it is perfectly focusing on small ants, even though it is a fully manual focus. So if you need to adjust this focus, notice the difference. It is very noticeable when it is out of focus and when I finally get it to focus. It has very good capabilities in this regard, but if it needs to be very tiny objects, if you want the real difference to be noticeable, see here another of the examples. When trying to record a leaf, you can't be that close, but we will notice this variation in focus, something that again is difficult to find in action cameras that generally all come with fixed focus, and it is very difficult to record scenes of smaller objects. Although it's completely manual, and you also get to hear the ring turn. Listen to the test. So obviously this macro focus module is intended for very specific cases, but it's not intended for you to use it by constantly varying the focus, but simply to adjust the focus to a certain object and keep the camera there. It doesn't offer us as much dynamism as autofocus, obviously, but it's something we don't usually see in action cameras. On the battery, we will also find an improvement, as previously we saw a capacity of 1,720 milliamp hours. Now it is 1,900, so it is a small increase, but it might help. In my test, I left the camera recording completely static in 4K at 30 frames per second, and it reached 1 hour and 41 minutes recording without stopping. It did get a little warm at the bottom, but I insist it was fully continuous recording, even though it was a relatively cool day. I suppose that if you record in very hot conditions, you would not be able to keep the recording constant at very high resolutions. Also remember that being static doesn't consume as much battery as if it were in motion because of the stabilization. So just take it as a reference figure, because really the battery can vary greatly by many other factors. Doing the same test but in full HD reached 2 hours with 33 minutes recording continuously. Now, with regard to charging, we must remember that in this case there is no charger included in the box or anything like that, so I used the charger with the power delivery standard to see what it was capable of in this case. Why isn't it advertised as a camera with fast charging or something like that? And in this case, with 15 minutes of charging, it recovered just 17% battery. So I guess charging is not going to do anything attractive. In 30 minutes, it got up to 37%. And the truth is, it's going very slowly in that sense. And it finished up to 100% in 1 hour and 30 minutes. So it is not a camera capable of recovering energy quickly. The recommended thing to do in this case, if you are going to have very long sessions, would be to buy the battery kit separately to carry several charged batteries. At the software level, this camera has good options, but by default it comes in an easy mode that I personally disliked, although I suppose that users who do not like to have so many controls will like this option more, since in this case it offers little customization. For example, when choosing how you want to record video, you simply have standard and HDR, but I think it is a simple interface that is too simple. That's why it's recommended to use the Pro controls. If you really want to have access to several options, remember that you can press this button if you want to change the framing and you want to record, for example, vertically. Even if you have the camera horizontal or with a traditional setting, the full frame, in short, has good settings in that sense that in fact you can also modify them from this section. Something I like is that you can save presets of different configurations with multiple settings to have them available in this section, so it can also be useful if you are constantly switching between various formats. In this button, we are going to be able to access the stabilization settings quickly, and at the bottom as well, access to the lens width we are using. We can also click on the settings button, which will take us to detailed settings for resolution and other video profiles. And finally, remember that by scrolling horizontally, we can switch between different modes. First can be sequence, which can help us to record a time lapse with different styles and settings. We will also be able to switch to photo mode or finally to video mode. And remember that if you swipe from the bottom up, you can access the gallery to quickly view all the content you have recorded. In this case, it also includes the speed control. If you want to see the videos in slow motion, and also includes the timeline to quickly navigate to a specific time. If you swipe from the top down, you can access some quick controls such as voice control that would allow you to tell it commands to start or stop recording. Personally, it's something I don't use because it doesn't always work quite right. There is another button to activate the camera sounds, which, as you realize in this case, is just to turn on or off this other option, which is the screensaver, which is simply to dim the screen when you are not using the camera or when you are constantly recording, and it also has screen lock. We are also going to find the front screen option, one more option to lock the rotation, since the camera is able to detect if you rotate the body of this device, and we are also going to have the possibility to turn off the indicator LEDs in case you need a completely dark scene. Automatic lens detection is also available, but manually you could adjust that option. Finally, there is also the option to pair some Bluetooth headphones, have the PRO controls, or access the full settings, as remember that this camera has a possibility to upload directly to the cloud all the contents as long as you pay your subscription. You can also obviously connect to the Wi-Fi network to make all this transfer, and in the general setting we will also have the quick capture option, so that even when the camera is off, you can press this button to initiate a quick photo or video capture. You can choose what the default setting is going to be when you turn on the camera, and if you want the screen to turn off automatically when it's not in use. We're also going to have the ability to turn the GPS off and on. And in the case of audio, in this section we can configure the volume of the beep that it makes every time you use it. In addition to configuring the external microphones in the screen setting, we will be able to configure the brightness, which as you realize is not automatic. And finally, it also allows you to turn on a grid if you want to improve your framing. We're also going to be able to adjust simpler things like date and time or regulatory information. And that's basically all we have available on this camera. And with respect to additional information of this camera, remember that you could use it as a webcam by connecting it to both Windows and Mac, but in both cases you must install an application so that the camera can be recognized. Although from this same application you could adjust things like framing or rotate the image, then it can be a good utility. We will also find support for Wi-Fi 6 networks. Unlike the last generation, which was Wi-Fi 5, then we might notice a much faster upload speed of content to the cloud. Finally, let's take a look at the Quick app. Now let's take a look at the app called Quick. Here we're going to be able to link the camera. We can give you a quick look at its current status in terms of available storage, battery status, and it's even going to point out if there's new content that we haven't downloaded to our device. Remember that this camera is able to connect directly to the Wi-Fi network, so from the mobile application you could also manage the connection. In addition, you could configure the automatic upload of content, since at the moment of connecting it to its charger, it can automatically start the backup to your GoPro cloud account, although that will obviously have an additional cost. In this case, they offer me a 50% discount on annual payment. You decide whether or not you want to have this storage to back up all your content in a simpler way. Either way, through the application, we can also transfer all the content we have stored in the camera. Notice that in this case, have an indicator, the contents that I already transferred to the camera, which is very convenient to be sure what is already there and what is not to transfer. You simply select the clips and you can press the download button. You can also delete content or with one button easily select many clips. Although I would have liked it if you could have selected in an easier way and not tap by tap, then when downloading content, it is important that you stay in the application, in the case of the iPhone. So in this sense, you are a little limited because it does not have an option to stay running in the background, and that can sometimes become very annoying because of the long waiting times. If they are very long videos, in this case they are short videos and it is still taking a considerable time to do this transfer. Once you have transferred your content, you can obviously review them from the Contents tab, and in this case divided into several sections. This can be cloud app storage or phone storage. If you want to give it permission to access other content you have recorded on the cell phone, as this app has its own built-in editor. If you have GoPro subscription, in suggestions, it's going to show you featured clips edited automatically. Then it could also help you share your content in a simpler way without you having to edit anything. However, it also has the editor, which, as you will notice, comes with some nice options. We are going to add in this case all these videos, and we are going to click on the Create My Edition button so you can see how it works. Let's wait a few seconds for everything to be synchronized, and that's it. In fact, it automatically applied a small template where it gives us the title of some edits in speed up or backwards, so you can more or less get an idea of how the result will be automatically. It also puts some transitions, as you realize. Then I think it is a good editor that could give you good comfort if you do not like to be editing for long periods of time. Then anyway, you can select a specific clip, for example this one that is upside down, and let's select it so you can see in the timeline specifically how it is behaving. You can trim some specific fragment and you can also frame it. In this case, I'm going to rotate it to make it look a little bit better. And well, there are actually several options available. You could even adjust the angle of the lens and many other things. Apply some color filters as well, but some features are exclusive to premium users, like adjusting the speed of the clip so you can make it go a little bit faster at some moments, slower at other moments. And as I say, here you also have some filters that you can apply without the need to have a subscription. And there are multiple categories, but the basic ones are without subscription, and the more advanced ones will require a special subscription. Although the text is simple, it does not allow us to select different fonts or anything like that, at least not from the text editor. We can select different themes for this automatic editing. For example, I'm going to select the action theme, and again, it's going to do an analysis of the content that I recorded, and notice that it's going to automatically do the editing again to suggest me these kinds of special effects and different transitions to make it look like different content. So the application seems to me to be a good complement. It is definitely well designed, although remember that some options will be paid, and that should be taken into account as well. Obviously, from the cell phone, you can also access the camera preview wirelessly. It's a preview in a lower resolution than the recording, so you shouldn't panic too much if you're noticing a slightly blurrier video. From here, you can start recording, take pictures, and even switch between different modes. But an important tool is also that it allows you to access live streams. So from your cell phone, you can set the GoPro to be streaming directly to the GoPro page itself, to Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, or any other RTM server. So it definitely does offer us good capabilities, and the app is well designed. It's stable, the connection is easy, and through the app, the GoPro is also going to receive updates. So here you manage everything you need. And with that, we have come to the end of this video. Let me know what you thought of this camera. I think, as I told you from the beginning, it has a very professional approach, giving new tools for this segment. Specifically, that's it for the moment. This has been all for this video. I hope you liked it. If you did, you know you can tell me, and I'll see you next time.